Getting to know InDesign. So I have our document open, or a document open. You'll see the interface looks, or might look, somewhat familiar. If you're familiar with the Adobe environment, it has a very Adobe look to it. Like I said, last class, I believe, PageMaker, I think it was, when Adobe bought PageMaker, they kind of like bought the program and slapped an Adobe skin on it, so they made it look very Adobe-ish. And over the years, they've been actually making it a little bit more functional than it was, and now it's sort of become the industry standard. But you can see some basic Adobe stuff, or basic layout stuff in general. You have your selection tools. You have a couple different tools if you're familiar with Illustrator. The selection and direct selection work exactly like they do in Illustrator. But then we have like a page tool, gap tool, which we'll get into, content collector. Type works 99% the same way it does in Illustrator, except that you have to have a frame for your type. You can't just sort of like free type in Illustrator like you can in Illustrator. Like if we're on our artboard here and I just click once to just start typing, it doesn't let you do it. Like you actually have to have like a content box, so you have to drag out, and then you can, you know what I mean? And that has to do with the page layout. That has to do with the function of the program. Everything sort of has to have a frame. Everything sort of has to have, you know, whether it's a placeholder or not, has to have a thing to put content into. So you can't just like, you know, use your text tool and just start typing. That being said, once you start typing, again, like once you get your sample text, I'm just going to arbitrarily put some stuff in there. You'll see, you know, you get your basic control changes as you use different tools. And since I was just using Illustrator, I had to look because stuff is in a sort of different place. But you'll see you have here where you can select your fonts, any modifiers, size, leading, all caps, small caps, superscript, subscript, etc., etc. And you get here if you're unfamiliar, any tool that has this little triangle in the bottom right, I know it's like super, super tiny. If you hold down the tool, it will pop up with other options. That little triangle means that there's other options underneath. So and you'll see there's already there's only 2 in InDesign as opposed to Illustrator. I think there's 4, at least 4 different options for type. There's your type tool, and there's type on a path in InDesign, and that's it. And type on a path works the same way it does in Illustrator. You have a path, like a circle, let's say. Use your type on a path tool to type along the path of that circle. You have your line tool, pen tool, pencil tool, which works similarly, if that's a word. To the pen tool, it's really more of like a drawing tool. Honestly, personally, I don't think I've actually ever used the pencil tool in InDesign. The pen tool works the same way it does in Illustrator or throughout Adobe in general. Here's another difference. You have your frame tools and your shape tools. The shape tools, again, work in a similar way to Illustrator. You have basic shapes, rectangle, ellipse, polygon. You have a couple more options in Illustrator. And they are shapes that you can create to create objects in InDesign. Your frame tools are basically, it has the same type shapes, but your frame tools are basically what you make to create content into. Not to confuse things, but you can also put content into shapes as well. But frames are slightly different in that they're a little bit easier to work with once you start placing text within frames. But anyway, I sort of find it a little redundant. I think that's a holdover from PageMaker, whatever it was. So your frames and your shapes are slightly different. Your frames are largely your content containers, whether you're placing images, text, etc., into these frames. And we'll get into that a lot throughout the semester. You have your scissors tool, which we may or may not get to. The free transform tool works in a similar way to the transform tool in Illustrator. Basically, the free transform tool, when you're on an object, allows you to transform an object, and hopefully it actually works. Transform, I selected the text first because it's on top, but it allows you to transform the object. This is where, again, if you're familiar with Illustrator versus InDesign, this is where it works very differently, especially when you have frames and you have to have like containers for all of your content. Let's see if I can do this with, nope, I want to select. Oh, I'm on my free transform tool, that's why it's not working. There we go. So let's see. Okay, now this is going to be shapes versus frames. So since this is a shape, it allows you to resize the shape just like you would in Illustrator. Now if you were to have a frame and you have content within that frame, if you're like for example, let's see if it actually does it. Good. So this image is inside a frame, right? So I grabbed that corner. I'll undo. I grabbed this corner or this middle resize handle, and I just move that up. What that does is it changes the size of the frame. It doesn't change the size of the image. We'll repeat this a ton throughout the semester because I know it's like kind of weird, again, if you're used to the other Adobe stuff. So you're basically just changing the shape of the box that this picture's in, right? The frame that it's in. If you want to change the size of the image, you see they get this little circle, this little target, or I think the book actually refers to it as a donut. You click on that circle, and now you see you get the bounding box for the image, and you can see the overlap. The image goes below the frame. So it's almost how masks work in Photoshop when you have like a clipping mask, or rather in Illustrator. I have a clipping mask in Illustrator. So if we were to move this up, so yeah, there's more image. It's just that text underneath the image. So they essentially were cutting off that extra text by using the size of the frame. So if you want to change anything with the image, you have to actually select the image, and now I'm holding shift to keep the proportions intact, but now you can change that, you can change the size of the image. We'll get into more specifics later, but you also have fitting, which is here. You can fit frame proportionally, which basically just makes the image, it takes, I'm gonna get this straight, whatever is the largest dimension, whether it be the width or the height of the content, it fits whatever is the largest dimension proportionally within the frame, right? Again, we'll go over this like a bunch of times. So you see fit proportionally or fit content. So when it fits content, it basically puts all the content proportionally within the frame. Whereas if you fit frame proportionally, what ends up happening is if you have, here, I'll go, let me make the frame a little bit smaller here so you can kind of see the difference. Okay, this is the major difference. So we're going to fit content proportionally. It takes the content and it resizes it so that it proportionally fits within the frame, right? So you can see the edge of the frame. So the longest side is the width. So it takes that width and fits it within the width of the frame. Yep.
Is that actually changing the resolution of the picture, or is it just?
Does it change the resolution of the picture? Yes.
Okay.
But just like anything else, like resizing anything in Illustrator or resizing, it does. What InDesign, which we get into later into the semester, when we start talking about images, I think a couple assignments, doesn't matter. When we start working with more specific images, you have what's called effective resolution. So if you have an image, for argument's sake, that's 10 by 10 and it's 150 DPI, but if you're printing it 5 by 5 inches, your effective resolution is essentially 300 DPI because you're physically printing it half the size, so your effective resolution doubles. Does that make sense? So once we start playing with that, but yeah, it does affect resolution for sure. So if you have something that's, again, going backwards, if you have a 5 by 5 image that's 300 DPI and you place it into InDesign and you make it 10 by 10 inches, your effective resolution is 150 DPI or PPI, pixels per inch. And all of that has to do with how well it's going to print, has to do with image quality. There's a lot of factors, and I think I mentioned it last semester too. Was one of the major things I learned from working at at Intention, where we did that crazy large format stuff. Was admittedly, it broke me for resolution. I don't understand resolution anymore because we had some stuff, and I think it just depends on how it's captured. To be honest, we had some stuff that was like Timberland was a big client of ours, and we had a ton of stuff come through from them. And obviously they're a massive company, so they have crazy professional photographers, right? There was images that came in that theoretically, mathematically, should have been terrible. Like we had images that were literally like 10 feet by 10 feet, and they were like 50 DPI. Theoretically, they should be awful. But for whatever reason, they looked awesome. And I don't understand how. And even our printer was like, I don't understand it. Sorry. So I don't know. It has to do with how it was captured, I'm assuming, or whatever. It's crazy. But then we've had the reverse where we've had, something that theoretically is like 150 DPI at 10 by 10, like the physical size we're going to print, and it should be decent. For our application, it was great because we printed at 75 DPI, I think. Anyway, we had something that was like 150 at 10 foot by 10 foot, and it looked awful. It was super pixelated and whatever, and it wasn't necessarily like a blurry photo. It was pixelated. It was just weird. So, yeah. So that's what we talk about effective resolution. It just kind of, honestly, you look at it on screen, and pretty much when you zoom in at 100%, if it's pixelated on screen, it's gonna pixelate. It's not like color, where colors might shift to on screen to print. If something is pixelated on screen, it's gonna print pixelated. So that's what we would generally do. We would pretty much zoom in at double the size of whatever we were gonna print and check the resolution that way, because it was just, to be honest, super confusing. But mathematically and theoretically, yeah, like all this stuff should. That was a long way to go for that. Chip, you had a question? Sorry.
Before you moved the image, you had already moved the frame.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't move the frame, is it going to let you move the image?
Mm-hmm. Yes. You can you can move the image within the frame. So before I messed around with the frame, before I messed around with the image. So if you just grab the image, you still have to click that circle. You can kind of, like, let's say we did want to crop off that little, how they did there. You can move the image within the frame. You can also resize the image, and I'm holding shift to constrain my proportions. You can also resize that image even bigger if you wanted to cut off. So yeah, you don't have to move. You can move them independently. Essentially, was that your question, basically?
Yeah,
okay. Yep. No, you don't have to. I know, and it doesn't really matter either way, too. Like, if you move the image first and then you realize, like, oh, no, I need to make my frame a little bit bigger or a little bit smaller to cut that off, you can move your frame afterwards. They work together, but they're independent objects on your artboard, so you can manipulate them independently.
What's in the frame.
Correct. Yep. Yeah, so all this extra image here is going to cut off. It only prints what you see. Yep. So again, going back to content fitting, we'll do more of this. There's a whole bunch of different options. What you see is, as you go through the tools, my whole point sort of for this was, as you go through the tools, you'll see your control, what's called up here, your control panel, changes as you have different things selected and as you have, different shapes selected or different tools selected generally. Your control and your tools Like going to text, obviously you get a lot more options for text. Your control and your tools change. Trying to think of what else. So we have our document window. It's pretty much, I don't want to say self-explanatory, but relatively self-explanatory. Our document window is the window, right? We're all familiar with that. You have your pasteboard, or what can be referred to as your workspace. Sometimes I'll call it free space as well. Those of you guys that know me, I have it like it's my sketch space. So generally anything beyond, if you have it set up, you have stuff in your pasteboard or in your workspace, you can export and use artboards to export, and it'll cut off. It'll only show what's on your artboard, which is nice, or your pages in this case. You have your menu bar here, your control panel, tools panel, and then various collapsible panels. Illustrator wasn't working for me this morning doing this for some reason. Where you have your different, depending on what setup you have your pages, color, strokes, gradients, swatches. Going into swatches, it's going to be one of the major things that you guys will notice that's very different going from Illustrator to InDesign is working with color, and we get into more assignment-specific things. But when you open a blank document in CMYK, in a CMYK color space, when you open a document, it only has the CMYK, and registration and paper. But as far as color goes, it has just the CMYK. It doesn't have your, like when we go to swatches, that's all the swatches we have. It doesn't have that default group of swatches that Illustrator does when it has, with the whatever 30 swatches plus some gradients, because InDesign is primarily a page layout program, and that's more for color separations and things like that. So you can create new colors, and if you open, let's say you place an image that has a specific color in it, it will add it to the swatches panel, or you can also add it manually to the swatches panel. But it's basically, InDesign basically doesn't want any information that's unnecessary. So that's why it doesn't have like your standard 30 colors or whatever. It's basically because everything is broken down into that 4-color process. And in this case, we have the CMYK, and then we also have RGB here, so it has both of them. And then it has paper, which is essentially white, but it's a white fill. They just call it paper in InDesign, again, because it's a page layout program. But like any other program, if you have, like, obviously you can't print white. So, theoretically, in an inkjet you can't print white. So if you had, even in Illustrator or InDesign, if you had something that was white and you were printing on blue paper, it would be blue. So that's the same kind of thing. So they call it paper instead of white because it's going to be whatever the substrate you're printing it on. So if you're printing it on a yellow substrate, the color is going to be yellow. So that's why they have that again. So the swatches are going to be something that's going to be, I feel like, the most noticeable difference between the two programs. Stroke and the gradient handle basically the same way. And again, we'll get into creating new colors and creating new strokes and rather new gradients and new swatches. You have your libraries, which honestly I tend not to use ever. And then this is for, since we're on interactive PDF, this is for some interactive stuff that we'll do towards the end of the semester. You can get into creating hyperlinks and bookmarks and buttons and forms, et cetera, et cetera. So getting into the workspace, you have various different workspaces. You can create new workspaces, custom workspaces. I have at home, I have my Adobe Suite set up the way I like it, and I have my workspaces named accordingly. But you have some basic ones here, and as you switch through, you have your advanced, which you see you have some effects and object styles, paragraph and character styles that are a little bit different. Book publishing is obviously going to be very different. You have some indexing, conditional text, cross-referencing, things like that. So you have tools that will allow you to do things for book publishing, digital publishing, interactive PDF, printing and proofing, typography. Typography we're going to use later, but you'll see you have the sort of focus here is going to be your paragraph styles, and your paragraph and your character styles are going to be more prominent. And then you have your, oops, that's not what I want to do. And then you have your essentials, which is basically pages, layers, links. Here's all your pages, and then you have your basic color stuff and your basic swatch information. Navigating through a workspace. There we go. Navigating through a workspace in InDesign. Now that I've sort of wrecked this. You have your pages, and you can set up your page flow. You can have, later we set up a document where you can have your document start with facing pages. So it starts, instead of starting on a right side, you can have it start with the spread or start with a single page. But navigating through is relatively easy. You have your pages here, and then if we drop down a little bit, you have your master pages, which are essentially templates we get into a little bit later. We have a master page assignment. You can basically create templates for different styles that you want to create, and then apply them to pages. So you have, you're not copying and pasting, you're not recreating the same thing over and over again. But going through, you can see your page numbers are here. You can navigate to a single page by double clicking the actual page, and that will force the page that you're clicking into the window. Or if you should be able to, no, it's probably because it's a little bit small, but if you double click, generally on the page number, it'll open up the spread, so you see the whole spread together. There we go, the whole spread together. Like Illustrator as well, any of the Adobe programs, if you hold down your space bar, it brings up your hand tool so that you can drag through a document, which is super, super handy. You know, again, so you can kind of align things. So instead of using artboards as Illustrator would, or canvas sizes like Photoshop would, you're using pages, because everything is designed to be a page, because it's technically for publishing. So you have pages instead of, and you can have a single page document and make, you know, if you're just making a flyer or something, you can certainly have a single page document in InDesign. But where InDesign really excels is with facing pages, print layout, and print output, obviously. Let's see. Tools panel I talked about. Sorry, going through my notes. Group of panels. Like all the Adobe, or many of the Adobe programs, again, we have all of our options for our tools, especially text. You have your paragraph. Again, if you're used to Illustrator, just coming from Illustrator last class, things are in a totally different spot. You have your paragraph functions here. You can turn that on and off, or separate them so that the text window is more to the left. Now the paragraph window. So if you prefer, you can kind of arrange that control bar if you prefer that. But anyway, you'll see you have your basic paragraph formatting, your different alignments. You have some more options. Indents, you can do first line indents. You can do right indents or left indents. You can do drop caps, space before, space before or space after, returns, which is really nice. Drop caps, which is that, you guys have seen a book where like a paragraph starts with whatever, once upon a time, and the O is really big and the NCE. So you can set that really easily. Trying to think. Some of the other text specific things we'll get into, it has a lot more. Like I said, with the space before and space after, technically, if you double space something, or if you want two spaces, like generally we kind of just hit return twice, right? In actual publishing and page layout, that's not the correct way to do it. You do you set the space after a return to do that. So when you hit that return, it's just one return. Because what ends up happening is with publishing, there's basically all sorts of things that can go wrong with text formatting. So if you hit return twice, somebody's formatting might be a little bit different, and then the returns might be closer together, et cetera, et cetera. So there's more specific text things. You can dock panels together. Like these are all docked and grouped together. Like if you want to undock your links panel for whatever reason and dock it into another panel, you can customize and group them together, and then you can name your workspace and save it. What I end up doing a lot is I'll accidentally move a panel out by accident, and instead of trying to put it back exactly where it was, you can go up to your workspace and you can reset. So that totally resets it, which is nice. And it'll also do that with if you have a custom workspace, you can reset. Or I'll move stuff on purpose and then reset it later. The zoom tool, fairly self-explanatory. We have our zoom tool here. You can click or you can drag into areas that you want to see. If you hit option, like with most of the other tools, option zooms out. You can also, like Illustrator, under view, you can zoom in, zoom out. You can fit spread in window or fit page in window, which is nice. I do that a lot, as you guys may or may not know. If you zoom out to look at a few things, or if you zoom way in, for argument's sake, let's say we want, for whatever reason, we want to get some crazy detail into this 795, and we zoom way in on it to mess around with it, and then we want to get back to a normal view. I'll hit Command 0, and I think I hit a minus there by accident. I'll hit a Command 0, and that'll fit the page in the window in your view. Or you can hit Command Option 0, and that fits the entire spread in your view. So those are a couple that I use a lot. And again, as we go through this will become more and more familiar. Bless you. Trying to think of what else before we move on. Scrolling with the hand tool, I just went over. Rulers and guides work in a similar manner. Bless you. Across Adobe products, you have your rulers here, and they default to whatever units you have it set up to be, whether it's inches, picas, millimeters, etc. If you want to pull guides, you can simply drag and drop from your ruler, and now you'll see all my guides showed up because I had them hidden. So now we have a guide on that page to work with. These are our margins that it's showing you. And if you want to see show or hide under guides and grid, you'll see we have hide guides, and that hides everything. Or show guides, or you can lock them. Sorry, go back to view. You can have objects snap to the guides. You can have smart guides on or off. I've gone over it before, but I actually really like smart guides. There's people that really don't like smart guides. You can delete all the guides. We'll get into grids and document grids later. Margins margins are margins. Like any other word processing program or production program, you have your margins, and they vary production to production or publication to publication. Some publications have quarter-inch margins. Some have eighth-inch margins. I would doubt that many have half-inch margins. That's pretty huge. But your margins are going to be basically, like if these are, the reason I say not many will have half-inch margins is because it's a half-inch here, and then what's going to happen on your spread is this would be an inch, which for a publication is, like a magazine, would be pretty large to have a to have your center gutter be an inch is pretty big. Usually it's a lot less than that, but that's going to depend on the publication, and you'll get, you'll have all those specs to set up when you're setting up your documents. I went over frames, frame edges. All frames have the frame edges that you can see, which work similarly to shapes. Screen modes work a little bit differently in InDesign. So you'll notice, and I think some of these examples are low res anyway, but you'll notice that when you place images, even if they're really solid resolution, when you place an image in InDesign, it automatically previews the image just to sort of save, because a lot of times you're working with, like in this case, you're working with a 6-page document and there could be a lot of images, and if there was a ton of high resolution images at full resolution preview, it can slow down your computer basically. So what it does is it sort of automatically goes into preview mode. There we go. So it gives you this sort of low res preview, and if you want to see what it would look like, there's a couple different ways to do it. Usually I just hit overprint preview, and that's still pretty low res, but you can see how the resolution changed a tiny bit. Let's turn off overprint. Yeah, that one's pretty low resolution anyway. But you'll see when you hit overprint preview, let's see if there's another one that's that one's a little bit better. I think a lot of these documents, a lot of that one's a little bit better. A lot of the documents for this class in particular, the images are lowish res to begin with, just to save space. But here might be a good example. Yeah, like you see how it pixelates a little bit more right here with the preview and overprint preview on. So if you want to preview like what it will actually print like, you can hit that overprint preview and that will show you the full resolution. You can also do under your view, under screen mode, this is normal view, which shows you everything. You can preview it, which gets rid of any printer marks or any margins, anything like that. So it'll give you a print preview. You can have bleed, which there's no bleed set up for this document. And bleed is essentially, I'll explain in a second, but bleed is essentially color that goes to the edge of a document. Or you can have a slug preview, which sometimes in a slug they'll have a little bit of extra space, usually at the bottom, that'll be information about the file. So if you have a slug, you can hide or show that slug. So we'll go back to normal view. So bleed, just to go over it very quickly, like since this blue here goes to the very edge of the publication, if you wanted that color to go to the edge of the paper, basically, you would want it to bleed over a little bit bigger. If you had it go directly to the edge, there's a chance that in printing there could be some paper shift, and you could get, where it cuts, you could get essentially a little bit of a white space if it shifts to the left a little bit, let's say, like 1/8 of an inch if that's their tolerance. So then you might get this gap and have this like white line on the edge of your document. So you want to make sure that if you want to have a bleed, it bleeds over a little bit to give yourself a little bit extra, so that if there is some shift. But usually any publisher or printer will have their guidelines. I'm trying to think, for intention we had a 2-inch bleed because we were printing massive, so 4 inches all around. So we had a 2-inch bleed on all sides at least to give us that extra 2-inch shift. And the reason for that was not because our materials would shift so much, but since it was on fabric, we're doing dye sublimated fabric, so we're printing on paper and then feeding it through this giant heat press and essentially doing a crazy professional iron-on transfer. where the dye gets actually sublimated into the fabric. What ends up happening is when you're using that heat process, the fabric can shrink. And depending on the type of fabric too, some fabrics shrink a little more, some fabrics shrink a little bit less. So we have that tolerance. We never had anything shrink more than probably, I don't even think we had anything come close to 2, but just to give ourselves a little bit of leeway. There is a fabric that does shrink a ton, but we generally don't print. We would only do solid color on it. Anyway, so you have things like that. So different companies will have different tolerances. A lot of publications will have like an 1/8 inch maybe, or like usually like an 1/8 inch bleed, something like that, because printing tolerances are pretty good. Copying and pasting objects or elements work just like any other program, any other Adobe program specifically. Working with smart guides and working with objects, like let's say we want to move this. Actually, let's select both. I knew that was going to happen. I'm trying to select these two. I don't know why this text frame is so huge. But working with smart guides, there we go. And you can change the colors if you don't like the default color for smart guides in Illustrator is pink. Is that like really bright magenta? The default for this one is like that greenish. So if you want to change that so it's a little bit more noticeable, you can. But it's showing you where you can snap. Oops. Snapping to the bottom of that 650, I believe. This is a really weird, that text box is massive and I don't know why. But you can see now here it's wanting to align the bottom of that text frame to the bottom of this text frame, most likely. But let's say we want to align these two center to center, or even the bottom of each text frame. So now the bottom of those text frames are aligned, provided they're actually the same size. So now those are in the same position. If you wanted to, this isn't doing exactly what I want it to because that text frame is throwing it off. But if you wanted to align the circles, circle to circle, you can have it snap roughly. You can have it snap so that the two centers are aligned. I believe they are, or close enough anyway. You get the idea. So smart guides work in a similar way across the Adobe programs. You can also align objects when you have, I'm just going to grab the circles here, which are actually not aligned. So you can align your objects, and in the same way, if you want to align this green circle to the blue circle, you have both these objects selected, and you click the one you want to align to one more time, and you see you get this highlight. And let's align centers. And now I didn't select this on purpose. And now we have our two circles are aligned. It aligns the green circle to the blue circle. Copying and pasting objects, like I said, works the same way. Hiding, locking, ungrouping all works in the same way. If you wanted to group these objects together just by shift selecting and either Command G or under Object, now it's hidden, group or ungroup. If you want, now if you grab this object here, I don't have to select both of them because they're grouped. Oh my, because they're grouped together. Sorry, hi buddy. Because they're grouped together, you can also ungroup them. Yeah, because they're grouped together. Let me ungroup these. Sorry, we got invaded. Object, there we go. Ungroup. That's super exciting. Working with smart guides I went over. I'm just trying to go over all these. Okay, so that's the basic interface stuff, honestly, I wanted to show you.